Haven Colony was the kind of place people back on Earth dreamed about, a paradise where humanity had finally gotten things right. The air was crisp, the soil fertile, and the skies untouched by pollution. It was a place of peace, free from war, where families thrived and children grew up without fear. John Carter had left Earth behind years ago, trading his past as a soldier for a quiet life as a farmer. He built a home with his wife, Emily, and their daughter, Sarah. His days were filled with tending crops, fixing irrigation lines, and watching his little girl chase fireflies at dusk. It wasn't just a good life, it was the only one he had ever truly wanted. Then the Zari came. It started with a flicker in the sky, a distortion, like heat rising off pavement. Then the ships appeared, massive, sleek, and impossibly fast. Within minutes, Haven's communication networks went dark. An electromagnetic pulse wiped out defenses before a single shot was fired. The colony's security forces, though well-trained, were laughably outmatched. These weren't just raiders or pirates, the Zari were conquerors. They descended on the colony like a storm. Towering creatures with reptilian features and razor-sharp intelligence, they moved with terrifying efficiency. Civilians were rounded up, weapons confiscated, and any resistance crushed. John and his family ran, but there was nowhere to hide. The invaders seemed to know every inch of the colony, as if they had studied it for years. John fought, of course. He wasn't the kind of man to stand by while his people were taken. He managed to take down 3 of them with an old hunting rifle before they overwhelmed him. He remembered the moment clearly, the searing pain as something struck the back of his head, Emily's scream, Sarah's terrified face. Then darkness. When he woke up, the colony was gone. The Zari had turned Haven into a slave camp overnight. Those who could work were shackled and put to labor in the mines. The young and the old, John didn't want to think about what had happened to them. He only knew that Emily and Sarah had been taken. He had no idea if they were alive. Most of the colony's defenders had been executed in the first wave, leaving the rest too broken or terrified to resist. A few tried to fight back, makeshift weapons, small ambushes, but it was like throwing stones at a tank. The Zari crushed every attempt without mercy. John found himself in the wastelands outside the colony, barely clinging to life. The invaders had left him for dead, assuming a wounded man in the desert wouldn't last long. They should have finished the job. Stumbling through the barren landscape, John discovered something unexpected, an old bunker, hidden beneath a ridge. He pried open the rusted hatch and fell inside, coughing as dust swirled around him. The place was ancient, a relic from an abandoned military project. Most of it was useless junk, but deep within the bunker, he found something that changed everything. Weapons. Not just guns, but high-tech gear, explosives, and a half-functioning tactical AI. More importantly, he found an encrypted distress signal. He activated it immediately, sending a message into the void. Someone would come. The human military, mercenaries, anyone. But as days passed with no response, reality sank in. No one was coming. Humanity was far away, and Haven was just another lost colony. John had spent his whole life running from war. But war had come to him anyway. He had one choice left. If no one else would answer the call, he would. John spent weeks in the shadows, watching, learning. The Zari were brutal but methodical. They moved in predictable patrol patterns, maintained tight control over their supply lines, and relied heavily on their technological superiority. They thought humanity was weak, broken. That was their first mistake. He started small, cutting fuel lines, sabotaging power generators, setting off minor explosions that sent the invaders scrambling. They never saw him, only the destruction he left behind. The first few strikes were meant to test them, to see how they reacted. When they dismissed it as mechanical failures or remnants of an old resistance group, John knew he had them right where he wanted. From the bunker, he gathered everything he could use: old sniper rifles, EMP grenades, even a modified stealth suit that barely worked but gave him enough of an edge. His days were spent scouting the terrain, and his nights were filled with silent ambushes. One by one, he picked them off. At first, the Zelnari barely noticed. Their arrogance kept them blind. But that changed the night he took down a full supply convoy. John had been tracking them for days, a heavily guarded transport carrying weapons and rations for the Zelnari forces stationed in Haven. He set the trap with patience, rigging the narrow canyon pass with explosives and waiting for the perfect moment. When the convoy entered, he triggered the blast. The lead vehicle was torn apart in an instant, and before the aliens could react, John was already among them, rifle in hand. The fight was brutal, fast, and ugly. He didn't have the numbers, so he relied on speed and precision, taking out the drivers first, then the squad leaders. The Zelnari were strong, but they weren't used to fighting someone like him, someone who wasn't afraid to get close, to strike and disappear before they could even retaliate. By the time the dust settled, John stood alone. Around him, wreckage smoldered, and the Zelnari lay dead. He let one survivor crawl away, bleeding, barely alive. Not out of mercy, he wanted them to know. To fear. By morning, the colony was in chaos. The attack had shaken them. Patrols doubled, commanders barked orders through their guttural language, and for the first time, John saw something in their alien eyes that hadn't been there before. Doubt. He wasn't the only one who noticed. The people of Haven, those who had given up hope, began whispering his name. At first, it was just a rumor. A ghost in the night. But as more Zelnari fell, those whispers turned into something more. Hope. A small network of survivors started helping him, smuggling weapons, passing along information, offering shelter. They were careful, cautious, but John could see it in their faces. They were remembering what it felt like to fight back. The Zelnari commander, Varric, issued new orders. The attacks were no longer random acts of resistance. They were a real threat. Curfews were enforced, anyone caught aiding the rebellion was executed, and squads patrolled day and night. But it was too late. The spark had already been lit. The plan had to be perfect. There was no room for mistakes. John and a handful of rebels had spent weeks gathering intel on the main slave compound, the place where the Zelnari kept the captured colonists, including John's wife and daughter. The facility was heavily guarded, its perimeter lined with energy barriers and automated turrets. A direct assault was suicide. Instead, they found a weakness. The compound's security grid temporarily shut down during supply transfers, a small window where the defenses were vulnerable. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They moved under the cover of darkness, slipping through the wreckage of the old industrial sector. Every step was calculated, every movement silent. The plan was simple: get in, disable the control center, and free as many prisoners as possible. They were 3 minutes from the target when everything fell apart. An alarm blared through the compound, followed by the heavy stomps of approaching Zelnari soldiers. The rebels barely had time to react before they were surrounded. Someone had betrayed them. Gunfire erupted. Chaos followed. John fought with everything he had, dropping enemies one by one, but they were too many. His people were cut down beside him, their blood painting the cold metal floors. He caught a glimpse of Emily and Sarah through the chaos, locked in a cell, terror on their faces. Then a searing pain shot through his ribs, and the world tilted sideways. Everything faded to black. John awoke in chains, his body aching, his vision blurred. The air smelled of metal and blood. Across from him stood Commander Varric. The Zelnari leader was taller than the others, his deep crimson scales glinting under the dim lights. He regarded John with a mixture of curiosity and amusement, as if he couldn't quite believe a single human had caused so much trouble. "You should be dead," Varric said, his voice a low growl. John said nothing. Varric circled him like a predator, speaking of inevitability, of the futility of resistance. He described in sickening detail what would happen to the colony, how humanity would serve the Zelnari Empire until they were nothing but dust. John didn't react. He let Varric talk, let him believe the fight was over. But what the commander didn't realize was that John had already won. While the Zelnari focused on interrogating him, they ignored the rest of the colony. The whispers of rebellion had spread further than anyone had expected. Even among the enemy ranks, cracks had started to form. John saw it in the way one of the guards hesitated, the way another shifted uncomfortably when Varric spoke of exterminating the weak. The Zelnari weren't as unified as they seemed. John pushed. He sowed doubt, questioning the commander's leadership, speaking of how many had already fallen, how the humans would never stop fighting. He didn't need to break Varric, he just needed to break his grip on his own people. And then, just when it seemed like hope was truly lost, an explosion rocked the facility. The rebellion had come for him. In the chaos, a Zelnari soldier unlocked his restraints. A defector. Someone who had heard John's words and realized the truth: Varric's war was a losing one. John wasted no time. He tore through the confusion, reclaiming his weapons, fighting his way through waves of enemies. The facility burned around him, alarmed screaming. He found Emily and Sarah in the chaos, pulled them from their cell, and led them through the collapsing structure. More rebels poured in, overwhelming the remaining guards. The tide had turned. But John wasn't done. As he looked at the smoke rising into the night sky, he knew this war wouldn't end with small victories. It was time to finish it. The attack began at dawn. John and the rebels had spent days preparing for this moment. The Zelnari command center was the beating heart of their occupation, a massive fortress pulsing with alien energy and guarded by an army of brutal enforcers. If they could take it down, the entire invasion force would collapse. They had no illusions about the odds. The rebels were outnumbered and outgunned. But they had something the Zelnari didn't: desperation. A species backed into a corner, fighting for its survival, was the most dangerous kind of enemy. John led the charge. Explosions tore through the outer defenses as the first wave of rebels stormed the gates. The Zelnari scrambled to respond, their structured ranks breaking under the sheer ferocity of the assault. Gunfire, shouts, and the roar of battle filled the air. John moved like a ghost through the chaos, cutting down enemies, planting explosives at key locations, forcing the Zelnari into retreat after retreat. The fortress shook as detonations ripped through its core. But the fight wasn't over yet. John pushed forward, deeper into the command center. He had one objective left. Varric. The Zelnari commander was waiting for him in the central chamber, standing amidst the carnage with a blade in his hand. "You have cost me much, human," Varric growled. John didn't bother with words. He lunged. The battle was brutal. Varric was stronger, faster, a creature designed for war. But John was relentless. He didn't fight with honor. He fought to win. Blades clashed. Fists connected. Blood splattered against steel. Varric swung hard, his blade slicing across John's shoulder. Pain burned through him, but he didn't slow down. He ducked, rolled, and struck back, driving his knife deep into Varric's side. The alien stumbled. John didn't hesitate. With one final move, he drove the blade into Varric's throat. The commander gurgled, eyes wide with disbelief, before collapsing in a heap. It was over. The remaining Zelnari panicked. Without their leader, they were nothing. Some tried to flee, others surrendered. The rebellion had won. But victory came at a price. The battlefield was littered with bodies, friends, allies, people who had believed in the fight and paid the ultimate price. John stood in the wreckage, bloodied and exhausted, his family safe beside him. Haven Colony was free. But as he looked toward the horizon, he knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The fires burned for days. Haven Colony had survived, but it was a shadow of what it once was. Buildings lay in ruins, crops had been torched, and the people, those who had made it through, were scarred in ways that could never be measured. John moved through the wreckage, helping where he could. He wasn't a leader, but people looked to him anyway. They needed direction, and whether he wanted it or not, he had become the symbol of their survival. The dead were buried, the wounded treated. The survivors scavenged what they could, rebuilding homes, setting up defenses, preparing for a future that was still uncertain. They had won, but the war had cost them more than they could ever recover. Then, just as the first sense of peace began to settle over the colony, the sky changed. A new ship arrived, but it wasn't Zari. It was something else. For a moment, John prepared for another fight, gripping his rifle tight. Then the message came. The Zari hadn't sent reinforcements. They had sent an emissary. The Zari who emerged from the ship was different from the soldiers John had fought, smaller, older, and without armor. There was no weapon in his hand, only a device that projected a translation into rough, broken English. Commander Varric acted alone. The voice crackled. Not sanctioned by the Empire. John narrowed his eyes. He had spent months killing these creatures, watching them enslave his people. Now they expected him to believe that the war had been the result of a rogue leader? The emissary continued. Varric was exile. Our kind does not war with humans. John didn't trust them, but the pieces fit. The Zari had acted like conquerors, but their tactics had been scattered, chaotic, more like a faction than an organized invasion. Had they really just been following one warlord's personal vendetta? And if that was the case, what else was out there? John didn't sleep that night. He sat at the edge of the colony, staring at the stars, thinking. For the first time since this began, he had a choice. He could stay, rebuild, live the life he had once dreamed of. Or he could prepare for the inevitable. Because if Varric had acted alone, then there were other threats out there. Greater ones. And next time, humanity might not be so lucky. By sunrise, his decision was made. Haven would rebuild. It would stand strong. But if the stars ever brought another war to his doorstep, John Carter would be ready.